I'm Executive Staff Officer with the Alberta Teachers Association and sit on the Parkland Board of Directors. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce to you the first plenary session titled Building Power to Win, Organizing versus Mobilizing with Jane McAlevey. And Jane has a great background. This is going to be a session I think you're really going to enjoy. Given her 20 years with labor and environmental justice movements, she is a doctoral student at the City University of New York at the moment. She'll finish imminently in the spring under Dr. Frances Fox Piven. And her background and her work, I think, is really important for all of us interested in social justice, social movements, organizations, labor, primarily because too often people are at the periphery of change as opposed to the center, or people are often positioned at the periphery of change as opposed to the center. And her work is really about mobilizing from the grassroots. So please join me in welcoming Jane McAlevey.
Somewhere at Cornell or now CUNY in the US. So I want to just make a few remarks this morning, and then I'm going to sort of run through a PowerPoint slide and have some discussion about what I've been interrogating and sort of investigating for the last few years. But by way of a few open remarks to that, I think first, I've been in Canada now for, I guess I arrived on Tuesday morning, and I was in Toronto doing some work with the Elementary Teachers Federation there. But I have to say, it is always nice for me to be in Canada. There are times when I wonder, why do I live in the United States of America? Really, it's much nicer up here. And that's, I have not been home since the US election, I need you to know. I just did a week in England, a week in Ireland, working with some trade unions there, came to Canada, and sort of eventually heading home. But I left the US before Election Day. And it's been very interesting to be someone who was very involved in electoral work, to be sort of out of the US and contemplating, really, should I actually just fly back home? Because it's kind of disastrous. So it's very nice to be here. And basically, I think the overall health of your unions and certainly your society is far better off now than it is to the South. Though I fear that beginning with CAFTA, NAFTA, and then all manner of global treaties, we are increasingly, people from the United States, I'm so sorry, are increasingly exporting very bad ideas north. And also sort of globally. I mean, we've been doing that for a long time, but it seems like with the globalization treaty process, we're facilitating, the deregulation of the entire globe. And we practiced that first in the US, so we're going to talk about that today. But just a little bit more about me to give you some sense of this. I grew up in a trade union household. My father and his side of the family were all in the building trades. My great-grandfather, McAlevey, was actually a founding charter member of the International Brotherhood of Carpenters in the US. And my mother died when I was a toddler, not yet in kindergarten. My father at that point was put in office by the Carpenters Union, and I really honestly thought that the brothers in the Carpenters Union Hall were my brothers. I thought I had like 300 of them. So I kind of grew up in the Carpenters Union Hall, running raucous campaigns, my father's local campaigns. He held local government office, and not surprisingly, when he finally remarried, who he remarried was the head of the Teachers Union, because that's who was endorsing his campaigns if they weren't the building trades. So it's sort of logical that he wound up marrying someone who was a teachers union leader. So picket lines were sort of a routine part of my childhood. In fact, a very routine part of my childhood. And until 2009, my entire life has been spent as an organizer. In 2009, I was diagnosed with an early stage and pretty dangerous cancer, quite deadly cancer. And the cancer sort of had the effect of doing something to me, literally, at 44, that no one had ever been able to do, ever, which was get me to lie down, and lie down for a whole year. And that year led to a lot of reflection, because I literally couldn't do very much except lay around. And the tangible product of that year at Sloan Kettering in New York City was one, it changed my relationship with nurses and healthcare workers who I'd been helping form unions for years. I never needed them, so it was sort of a really dynamic experience for me to like re-fall in love with every healthcare worker in the world. But the tangible effect of it was the first book I wrote called Raising Expectations and Raising Hell. And that I intend to basically take a whack at the second book. I'm about halfway through it right now. And the second book basically takes the stories and experiences I had and wrote about in Raising Expectations and Raising Hell. And it's going to transform them into a more theoretical examination of the very same issues, a preview of which I'm going to sort of run through this morning with you. And essentially what I'm examining is what works, and what works now, and what's working now, and why. But in the second book, I'm examining and interrogating movements and campaigns that I had nothing to do with, which is sort of a pleasure. You don't have to write about your own campaigns. It's like nice to go out and have this few-year break in the Ph.D. program to sort of read books, take time, learn more about history, and go dive into other people's struggles and sort of reinterrogate the question of what's working, testing my assumptions of things I thought, sometimes having them confirmed, sometimes not. But it's really been sort of a delicious break for me as an organizer. So, in particular, I'm looking at unions that continue to strike in the US at a time when people say we can't strike in the US. So all the work I'm doing is studying strikes and sort of what makes it still possible in the US today to have successful strikes, and I'm going to argue in the morning presentation, therefore a very strong union, therefore very strong contracts, therefore still the capacity to change people's lives in profound ways. So my earliest training was on picket lines as a kid and running electoral campaigns because the precinct counts were always going off in the house and how to kill the opponent and all that stuff. So, and then my first real training as a young adult was as an Alinsky trained organizer, and I think this will make sense when I talk about my theory of what's been going wrong in the US, which again I fear is sort of a cautionary tale for you here and elsewhere. So my first training as an organizer was as an Alinsky organizer by the Chicago-based Midwest Academy of Organizing, which is an Alinskyite school in the US. How many people here know the name Saul Alinsky? How many people here differently know the book Rules for Radicals? Yeah, that's it. Great. I grew rather dissatisfied with the Alinsky model that I've been trained in, and after several years, wound up, I heard by Croak traveling in Latin America, meeting this guy John Gaventa, and being recruited to work at a place called the Highlander Center in the South, which is sort of a Frarian-based adult popular education center. And I would argue that it was that training, that grounding in popular education, which I then carried into the U.S. trade union movement, and it framed the entire way I thought about what a union is, what it should be, and how I went on to eventually lead campaigns and then a union myself. I want to open this morning by stating a couple of things, which is this. In my read of history, I think the struggle for decency and respect and recognition is several hundred years old, if not several thousand. I think that capitalism as a political economic system has been creating precarious work, and by the way, planetary disasters, for at least a couple hundred years. A slogan first recorded in 1886, I'm sure it was said before that, but the first known recording of one of my favorite slogans, which reminds me of the work that we do and of our as of yet unfinished business on this planet, is this: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. That was first recorded in 1886, and I think the struggle for control of out-of-control lives is quite old, actually. And in E.P. Thompson's classic book, The Making of the English Working Class, which I think is utterly brilliant. That's an example of a book I've gotten to read since I sat down in the Ph.D. program. I never had the pleasure of reading that before as an organizer. And there's so many parts of that book I loved. And one is just from the preface to the book where he says, "I do not see class as a structure, nor even a category, but as something which, in fact, happens and can be shown to have happened in human relationships." I think neoliberalism today is reshaping the working class again. Because the elite, the profiteers, as we're calling them here, I think it's a good name for them, because the elite, aka the profiteers, have made the entire planet their turf, their sort of globe, their playground, pitting workers in every country against each other, there is an enormous rise in the precariat. For what now looks like a brief moment in time, workers in Canada, the US, and Europe in very large numbers, I think, struggled and won really positive change. After World War II, World War I, World War II certainly, consolidated it, and it lasted for decades, only to see it slowly eroding
some cases quickly eroding today. And I think partly, by the way, this was the fault of our own unions, who didn't struggle with an internationalist class in mind, but rather with a nationalist sort of approach to the work. So we're paying a little bit now for some of the way that we built our trade unions. This left us very vulnerable to the moment that we're in, and my book and my talk is going to outline, by the way, a series of other strategic errors that we've made in the trade union movement. But on the other hand, I have had the incredible experience over and over of working with workers who in fact were able to, through hard-fought struggles in very recent times, win contracts that did in fact change their lives. To win contracts that did guarantee them an end to the madness that has become the out-of-control, overstressed work life of workers in the USA. Workers won things like self-scheduling, a really novel concept in the US and almost unheard of, meaning that the workers themselves in 3 big hospitals where we bargained contracts, actually within parameters of a certain number of hours per shift, et cetera, were in total control of setting, making, and changing their own schedules, absent any conversation with shift managers, which was about as radical an experience as I've had the pleasure of seeing workers engage in. They were able to do things like, take the day off to go see their kids play at school, because they could call a colleague and say, can you shift with me today? And there wasn't some oppressive manager saying, your schedule is a schedule and you can't do it, right? Or they could just take a break, or they could decide they wanted to help their sister get ready for a wedding. And these are all stories I remember from sitting at the contract negotiations table. Or any number of things that a human ought to be able to do with the 8 hours that we will. The workers won contracts that took them from paying $400 a month, this is the US, not Canada, $400 a month for health insurance for themselves and their families, literally, to zero, to fully employer-paid health care in one contract fight with one strike. And these workers didn't stop with their own successes at work. They forged a broader culture of resistance to beat back the daily insults the elite throw at workers at work, but also at home, when they punch the clock and they've left their place of work. And these victories came about because workers themselves built power, the kind of power that was sufficient to create a real crisis for the employers. And it's when we are capable of building real power that we can achieve that kind of transformational change. So I say that by way of introduction to what I'm going to chat about this morning with you for I think about 35 minutes or so. I'm going to start timing myself. And then we should have a good half hour for questions and answers and discussion and things like that. So here we go. The conference program itself, it's printed in our program, it asks 2 questions. First, why at a time of remarkable wealth production, the money seems to be, and I cut out a few words, skewing towards a small minority. And I think we talked somewhat about that last night, and I'm sure we're going to talk much more about it today. The conference program also asks, what can and should be done about it? I'd like to argue that's what I'm focusing on this morning. I'm sort of compulsively obsessed with what we can do about it. Because I think there are a ton of really good policy prescriptions that we all want to win, and the problem is we lack power to win it. So, how can we create a crisis for the profiteers, which is sort of my frame and my lesson as an organizer. It's when we create crisis that we can win great change. I'm going to argue not without an army of tens of thousands of skilled, what I'm going to call organic worker leaders, who have been battle-tested, whose politics and identity has been forged in struggle, and who themselves go on to become organizers. There will never be enough staff, and the methods and the models that we do our work guided by, I'm going to argue, matter tremendously as to whether or not we can slow down the destruction of the planet and slow down the destruction of all life on it, including humans and human dignity. So basically, I'm looking at sort of the options at the forces of good for sake of a broad category. It's everyone in this room. Sort of options that the forces of good have been deploying sort of in my lifetime. One is charity. I think we touched on that last night, and I couldn't agree more with Guy about his analysis of what's wrong with charity. Though we may need it in moments of desperation right now, it should not be our modus operandi. We've also deployed, sort of as the people of good, certainly in the US, but certainly also here, a lot of advocacy, which is people acting on behalf of other people. Well-intentioned, good folks, There's tons of organizations in the US sitting in the nation's capital and our state capitals that lobby on behalf of people and decide the agenda themselves, and it's generally a good agenda, but it's advocacy work. It's someone deciding that they're an advocate on behalf of everyone else. Then there's two more categories that I'm going to focus on this morning, which are the ones I'm more interested in as a scholar and in real life as an organizer. The third is mobilizing, and the fourth is organizing. I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about mobilizing and organizing, and getting into the nuance of what I think the distinction is, because it's my basic belief, again, at least in the US, although I've been increasingly hanging out in Canada, thank you very much for letting me come up often, and also in Europe, and I've spent many years in Latin America when I was younger. I think that the crucial debate we have to have right now, I think most of us understand the limits of charity and the limits of advocacy. I think there's great confusion about what's mobilizing and what's organizing, and that we have to try and get it straight if we want to build power again. So organizing to me is all about relationships. It's all about relationships. It's the ones we build by developing meaningful solidarities among majorities. Building solidarity, and the word majority will be a key theme throughout my discussion this morning, because I'm not interested in minorities. I don't mean people of color in the US, et cetera. I mean minorities of people being engaged. The second kind of thing, relationships that organizing is consumed by are the ones we disrupt. Rupturing and diminishing existing elite power among the minority, like the 1%, right? That's part of what organizing is too. I'm going to argue we don't do that very well unless we've built movements that can capture majorities of people, not small numbers of people. And that the life lesson in the US certainly is that in the 20s, 30s, 40s in the labor movement, and that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in our civil rights movement, we deployed organizing and not mobilizing strategies, which led to huge change. So here's my first whack at sort of talking a little bit with you theoretically about what I think the distinction is. Mobilizing to me means essentially herding people. It's about getting those on our side off the couch. It's sort of the technology of turnout. And it's been dominant in the US since the 1970s. We've sort of turned after our great movements of change. By the way, not voluntarily. We had this thing called McCarthyism. We jailed a whole bunch of people. We killed some others. We shot a bunch of black leaders. We put a bunch of communists in jail after the labor movement. We did a really good job in the US at destroying the very skill set that led to great changes in the US. We didn't just destroy people. We sort of wiped the skill set out of the movement, in part. And we went to this kind of advocacy mobilizing model, which is a very staff-centric model. And it's about sort of mobilizing bodies into actions. It's largely dominated in sort of what I call self-selecting issue work, environmental work, a housing fight, something where you put up a flyer, which I did a lot in my youth, put up a flyer and hoped people came, and maybe door knocked about an issue, a fight, a flyer, and people came. I'm going to call that sort of self-selecting issue work. And who it largely attracts are people who are already basically in agreement with us. They come to the meeting because they're pissed off that their kid's being poisoned. They come to the meeting because something is going wrong in their neighborhood. So I'm going to call that self-selecting issue movements. And my experience is we mostly spend a lot of time talking to ourselves in those movements, not talking to people who are not in the room with us. And I'm going to argue it doesn't grow our base. It neglects political education and sort of worldview or ideology. And it's largely, for the last 50 years in America, demobilized and de-skilled our base. And I'm going to argue that mobilizing is a campaign approach. Then there's this thing called organizing, which at the center of it, in my view, is about base expansion. How do we expand the universe of people who are on our side, who we should then be effectively mobilizing? The problem in America is we stopped organizing. So the base of people who we're talking to keeps shrinking every year. The mobilizing model means we're not really expanding our base. You have to do both. It's not that mobilizing isn't important. It's very important. It isn't that we don't have to do it well. We have to do it very well. We saw that in the last election. But organizing is how we expand the universe of people who we can then mobilize. So it's a two-part dance. And I think we've forgotten how to organize, essentially, in the US. So organizing brings the unconvinced and what I call the undecideds into our movement. Again, it's base expansion. In that movement, unlike in a mobilizing model, it's the grassroots leaders themselves who do the work. They do it sometimes and often, initially at least, with the help of some staff, generally organizers, who I think play the role of teaching and coaching the skill of struggle. In my view, the job of an organizer is to teach the skill of struggle and teach it well, so that we're developing more skilled people and more organizers in the movement. Everyone is involved, right? In a labor campaign, for sake of argument, the employer, the boss, hires the workers. In a congregation-based organizing model, the parishioner attracts members from different classes and bases. In a housing fight, the landlord sort of contracts to tenants, right? So there's structures where we do what I'm going to call structure-based work. And when we attack a structure to get a majority of it, we go to talk to people who aren't yet with us. In fact, they're rarely with us in the beginning. And it forces us to expand the base of who is with us by focusing on the capacity of developing organic leaders, which I think then builds a fighting army, which I'm going to argue is a movement-building approach. And that's a core difference between mobilizing and organizing, which is sort of, I'm just going to run through, I think, how we got there and why we should change what we're doing. And again, it's in the US, but I see it creeping in here, and I see it creeping out all over Europe. And we've been exporting this thing from the US trade union movement called the organizing model, and it just makes me flippin' crazy. Because it's a mobilizing model, not an organizing model. And this is definitely sort of a preview of the book to come. So, and I just had a ton of discussions with folks in Europe about it. It's really interesting how much it's being exported right now, without a lot of attention to is it working. And I'm going to argue that the US elections just a few weeks ago sort of undermine the idea that what we're doing is working in the US. When only 36% of people turned out to vote in a very important election, which meant most people stayed home because they saw no difference in the political parties. Most people stayed home because we're having, again, a crisis of low expectations where people think, I don't need to go vote, doesn't do anything, doesn't change anything, doesn't matter. That's a failure of our work. And in particular in the state of Wisconsin, by the way, closer at home when I'm sitting in Ontario talking to folks, but never too far from here and still on the border. In Wisconsin, when we attempted to recall a governor, we progressives in the US, right, led by unions initially, led by school teachers initially, public sector workers, everyone climbed on board, environmental groups, everyone out there fighting in Wisconsin, when the governor decided to take away collective bargaining rights essentially from the public sector. We went into a recall strategy where the margin of defeat for our side was completely inside of the union household vote. So Labor went all out to change the governor who had taken away collective bargaining, and 38% of union households voted to keep the governor in that election. And the same numbers just played out again in the election 2 weeks ago. So there's something wrong with our model, which I'm going to argue is because we're not talking to large numbers of people in a meaningful way anymore. We might be tweeting them, we might be Facebooking with them, but we're not actually engaging with people and putting them into struggle. And so we are losing. So the lessons I'm going to draw on today primarily come from, and I just want to state what this is, sort of my work doing private sector organizing, union fights, not just organizing, but private sector union fights in right to work red USA states. And I was initially sort of miserable when I was told by the National Union, SEIU at the time, that I was going to get sent to conservative states that were in the right to work part of our country, which is now greatly expanding, by the way. And I was miserable about it because it was like, really? I have to go there? All right. I'm going to leave the comfort of the Northeast and head into southern conservative, voting Republican in high numbers, anti-union environment. And right to work, of course, means right to work for less in the US. It's where we have the worst union laws, not the best, although the best is probably worse than anything you have here at this point. So, but we have, fundamentally it means that workers never need to join the union, right? So a right to work state, even if workers vote to form a union, the worker can decide every day to join or not join. So that's what a right to work state is. What I think it taught me was a lot about organizing versus mobilizing. So just to be clear in the US, quick pointer, organizers can't go into or near a private sector work site if we're organizing or if we're doing a contract fight or if we're fighting to a strike. We might, if we'd won good contract language, have the right to access after the organizing drive. But to win an organizing campaign in the US, in the private sector, we cannot touch the property. We'll get arrested, the cops will come, they'll arrest us, it's a bad scene. Doesn't really motivate workers to form a union when guys with, the lights show up and arrest you. So what it really means is that workers have to carry their movement. They have to build their own organization. It forces us to not be lazy, and it forces us into a very tight methodology about what I call identifying the organic worker leaders in every facility. Because they themselves have to have a war inside of their facility, and whether or not they win it is up to them. It's not up to work that we can sort of make up for them on their behalf, because we're not in that workplace. And by the way, these are wars in America right now. So I'm calling it sort of the hardest test for what I think about sort of real organizing and this key issue of, can we identify organic worker leaders? And it's not just about workers, by the way. And even though I'm sort of talking about the US trade union movement, because I spent my first half of my life doing environmental work and community-based organizing work, I think all these lessons are essentially the same. I think our environmental movement rarely talks to people. It's an upper middle class movement. It's more white than not. Yes, we have a grassroots base to it. I worked mostly in what was called the environmental justice movement as a very young organizer, mostly in communities of color, poor people, et cetera. They don't have a lot of capacity and skill, and the big mainstream environmental movement ain't talking to them, and it's a big problem. So although I'm talking about as a case study sort of the failure of US unions in the last 40, 50, 20 years, really 20, I think that the lessons apply to our entire social movement in the US. This mobilizing versus organizing dynamic, I could do this discussion about the environmental movement, but I'm doing it about what the book is about, which is about the recent failures in the trade union movement. So, common factors for US union failure: globalization, automation, and a changing labor employment structure. That's the common reasons, along with barriers of US labor law, which I call boss law, because it's not really labor law. It doesn't work for any workers in the whole country. It really works well for the bosses. So we prefer to call it boss law. And then sort of oligarchic tendencies. These are what you sort of read about. Now that I'm actually not organizing or leading contract fights or strikes and like reading the literature, it's quite interesting to me. It's actually fascinating to sort of read what the common attributes are for why we're failing. I'm going to argue the chief factor since 1995 is 2 words: bad strategy. The unexamined factor in union revitalization literature is the central role of strategy. In post-1995, and for folks who don't know this, in 1995, why that year? Why am I looking at this time? In 1995, in the United States, we had a very big change in the American Federation of Labor and our National Labor Federation. In short, a whole new team came in. There was the first contested election in the history of our National Labor Federation. So 50 years old, never contested election. We finally had one. That was probably overdue, by the way. Contested elections is a good thing, I think. So might imply there's some democracy going on, small d, deliberative democracy. So we had our first contested election, and a whole new crop of people came in promising great change in America, in our labor movement. And I then got recruited very quickly in because I'd been working very, very closely with a bunch of trade unions working in the South. And I finally believed this maybe was time for me to go back to my family roots. You should know that my father was always profoundly disappointed that I wasn't a trade union organizer from the time I was 17, because that was what the family was supposed to do. I cut out for a while, went to Latin America, realized that our trade union federation was complicit in killing actual trade unionists in Latin America, and it kind of turned me off at about age 19. So in 1995, I come back in, and many people sign up and start to work in it. We throw huge financial and human resources into it. The issue is not money. The issue is not a lack of money in our labor movement. So we threw huge financial resources into it, human resources into it, trained a bunch of organizers, put them in there. And then the chief strategy becomes what I'm going to call shallow mobilizing and advocacy, and not very much deep organizing. We take strategy away from workers and away from the work site. US unions, by the way, are not monolithic, just like yours are not. So I just want to note that. There is no one single union in the USA. And the research question that I'm sort of directly interrogating, I sort of mentioned that in the intro, again, is this issue of I'm looking at comparing what works and what doesn't. I'm going to make an argument in a minute that what has always worked for us to build strong movements, which is about grassroots leaders and identifying the most respected organic workers among them in the community and at home, is what still works in the US. And that though we shouldn't return to Keynesianism or a call for it, we do have to examine the organizing models that have always worked in our country and that still do. So I'm looking at a lot of service workers. I'm looking at, do they still run strikes? Do they win strikes? Do they win high standards? And therefore, I will argue, well, I mean, it's sort of, you have to sort of see worksite power and workers as key if you're still running strikes. The two kind of go together. So briefly, the new labor movement. I'm going to blame this guy, Saul Alinsky, on a lot of this, just so you know, who I was trained by, Saul Alinsky people. And he gave us some very good stuff, but he also gave us some bad stuff. And I think that Saul Alinsky, who was alive like 1909 to 1972 when he died in the US, who wrote Rules for Radicals, which I got as a young organizer, almost everyone I know got Rules for Radicals, that this guy, who was the single biggest influence on the development of community organizing in the USA, who, by the way, was a University of Chicago student who studied mobs and gangs, just an insight to the model. He studied mobs and gangs as a graduate student, undergrad and graduate student at the University of Chicago. He wrote 3 books. The only one that people mostly read is the one that's called Rules for Radicals. And it really privileged self-interest. It was fundamentally anti-ideology. He said ideology was a horrible thing to have. And it privileged the concept of self-interest, delinked from ideology. And it went on to have a huge influence in the US. And right now, most of what we call the new labor movement in the US since 1995, the crew that came in to the contemporary labor movement to take over and reorganize America, most of the leadership came in through an Alinsky-trained organization or formation, which I think is actually very important. Because they brought the campaign model, not a deep organizing model, with them. They brought a mobilizing model into the movement, and they didn't have a deep organizing model, which was more typical of political parties, left parties in the US in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and also in the civil rights movement. So lots of them came through the United Farm Workers, which I argue was the first sort of real union campaign to take the center of struggle away from the worksite with boycotts and campaigns and all that stuff. It was a minority worker theory. Again, minority meaning a minority of workers involved, not anything else, but a minority of workers involved. This has become later replicated in the Justice for Janitors campaigns in the US and a handful of other good things, though Justice for Janitors is great. And what I want to say about this is that the mistake, I think, is that this will work for low-wage workers. It's very possible it works for low-wage workers. And what's really true is it's not going to work for workers who are not super low wage. And this is getting back to the question of power and how do we analyze power. And do we analyze power before we go into campaigns? And do we assess how much power we need to win? And I'm going to argue that you can do sort of corporate campaigns and take the struggle away and do boycotts and all this stuff if the cost of concession to the employer is very low. So in a janitor's campaign, the cost of settling a janitor's strike or struggle in the US, it's about 0.5% or 1% cost total to the employer to settle, which means that if you're annoyed and you bang on drums and you get a minority of the workers involved and they're good and they go to church and they bring their one minister with them who's known as the area progressive guy, and they go on strike and they go bang a bunch of drums in corporate headquarters, they in fact will win a contract. And they deserve it, and that's a good thing. The problem is we have decided that this is some ubiquitous strategy that's going to work for everyone, and it's not. So my life was spent in hospital fights, where the cost of settlement to win a hospital fight for a group of workers, the cost to the employer is 75 to 80% is the cost of the workers in a hospital, which means there's a difference of about 79% of the fight. So you have to look at what the cost of the concession is going to be as relative to how much power we need going into a fight. So a strategy that involves a handful of healthcare workers running around a big building, a hospital headquarters, and banging on a drum is not going to win a hospital worker a good contract. It's not. But we think it will. So the 1199, which is what I'm looking at, it was the old Healthcare Workers Union in the United States, founded by people who were left party people in America. They worked at the Trade Union League. These two guys, Davis and Godoff, I won't bore you with much detail about them, but the origins are that they're in left parties in the US in the 20s. They both were pharmacists. They spent 20 years, 15 years trying to build pharmacist-only unions. And then in 57, this guy Davis meets this guy Godoff, and they begin to organize hospitals really for the first time in the US, and they go hospital-wide. All right, so fast forward. I'm going to say that there are three sets of factors that determine whether or not we've got a fighting union and the kind of union that can engage in transformational change. Not transactional change, not a cheap wage increase, transformational change. Three factors. The first is what's the purpose of the union. The second is the power analysis of the fight. Well, I was just describing some of that. Are we actually going for a win that's going to cost a lot of money? I have to say that every time someone invites me to march on Wall Street, I just want to barf. We can't even organize a school board election in the US, and we think we're changing Wall Street. We are not clear about the power needed to take on Wall Street. So we have to look at the power that we need to build to actually take on Wall Street. So I think looking at really hard fights is a good way to look. So what is the power analysis of the fight? How much power do we need? Is disruptive power in the streets for 5 hours in Wall Street? And by the way, I've been arrested many times there, so it's great, it's fun, I love to do it. It's just super clear that we're just having a fun, disruptive day, and we're going to get some media attention and hope to do some narrative change, and none of that's going to add up to power to win a fight. So, and then the third factor is sort of the governance methods. So one, the purpose of the union, I'm going to spend a few minutes on more than others, run you through the other two, and then stop and have some discussion. So purpose of the union, which to me is fundamental to are we building a transformational culture of resistance, or are we just cutting a deal for a bit of a wage and something else? And here's what it is. I'm essentially arguing there are choices that we make. This is what goes to bad strategy. There are choice points. Humans, agency, human beings are making choices about how we're doing our strategy. And in what I'm calling the Alinsky New Labor Model, to the left, starting with the purpose of the union. The purpose of the union is workplace only, meaning it's not worrying about what happens when the worker goes home. It's material conditions only, meaning the struggle is about a wage increase, maybe health care, but they probably haven't had a strike over scheduling, for sake of argument. And definitely the belief system is at best unclear, meaning, the purpose of the union is sort of business unionism. It's just to get a contract with some improvements in it. Whereas the purpose of the union in a transformational model of trade unionism combines an emphasis on both workplace and non-workplace issues. I reject the term community labor and community labor alliances as a particular point of semantics, because as an organizer, by the way, semantics is deeply important. How we talk about the work is how people talk about the work. How we model it and talk about it is how everyone else starts talking about it. So semantics to me matter a lot. And I don't like the frame community labor because it means that workers sleep at work. Now some who are very precarious do. But largely workers don't sleep on their job. Most of them go home. And they go through a neighborhood that's got a whole mess of stuff going on. And they don't have childcare. And the rents are too much. And there's gentrification going on. And they're getting kicked out. And they can't afford their housing. And their rents are too high. And blah, blah. Or they can never afford a house to begin with. And there's crime and drugs. And there's a whole series of things. And I'm arguing in a transformational union model, which is what we were doing, what I was trained in, and what we were doing for the decade that I was involved, is about equal concern to workplace and non-workplace issues. What matters to the life of the worker. Workers don't like divide themselves in half. Like some things matter to me at work, nothing matters at home. It's not how workers see the world. They have a set of issues that are deep and affecting their life. So in a transformational model, the role of the union is to look at both issues. And it's also to work on material and non-material issues, things like scheduling, things like decency, things like respect, things like real labor management committees that have real power, so you can actually change what's going on, safety and health. What Bozo ordered, the lights that don't work in the operating room, all of it, right? Like where workers actually get to take some control of the production of the workplace. And the belief system is quite explicit. It's called class struggle. That is a transformational model, and we have little bits of it still in the US, and we're still winning. So, in this model, the role of the workers is central, and it flows from, is your vision about class struggle and teaching people how to struggle and be the liberators in their own lives, or is it about acting on behalf of people? In the sort of Alinsky New Labor model that we've been operating under and that we're exporting heavily, the model is focused on pro-union activists. They're sort of key. Like the first workers walk up to us and say, I want the union. We sort of stop there. And then we look for ones that are telegenic. And we call them authentic messengers. And I kid you not, this is currently the language in a couple of unions in the US. We don't have workers who are leaders anymore. We have authentic messengers. We dress them up, we media train them, we put them in front of the legislature, we put them in front of the media, and we train them to talk very, very well on message about everything that's wrong. They're sort of seen as flat. Workers are seen as flat. It's a very staff-driven model, and a minority of workers are involved. By contrast, in the transformational model, the absolute focus is on finding, identifying, and helping to develop what we call the organic worker leader. They're key to the model. The workers themselves are the most important part of the model. We then develop what's called the organic worker leader to the staff organizer level to the best we can. We literally train people who are the organic worker leaders. We train them and help them and skill them and coach them and mentor them and eventually move on, because if we do it right, they're going to lead their work site for a long time, not just in the organizing drive. They're going to lead their contract fights. They're going to be capable of running strikes in their hospitals or wherever the workplace is. And it means a majority of workers are involved. Absolutely a majority model. It's about getting a majority of people involved. And who the organic worker leader is, let's look at that for just, all right. I actually want to skip. I'm skipping for 1 second. I'll come back to that other slide. So who are leaders? Continuing this little diagram, in the Alinsky New Labor model, we call the leaders people, we anoint them, staff anoint them, organizers find them, we meet them, they're great, they want the union, they're going to be great. And then we do this thing where we develop them to be authentic messengers. In the sort of more left transformational model, organic leaders can only be identified by a majority of the workers themselves. No staff person is capable of identifying an organic worker leader. As organizers, we find out who they are by having conversations with the majority of workers in every unit and every shift in a workplace. And this plays out in real life, in an environmental campaign, anti-justice campaign, all those things I do. Great. I see a little timer right there. That's good, thanks. So I'm going to wrap. So how we find them is a whole skill set. And all they are the most single respected workers in every shift. And they're often not pro-union, they're often anti-union. They can be anti-union when we meet them. They can be completely undecided about the union. But what they are is the organic leaders who can lead large numbers of people in a struggle. We can't identify them, only their coworkers can. So I want to go backwards now. The power analysis of the fight. I'm going to kick this up so we can get into some discussion. The power analysis of the fight, which is the second factor I described. Are the workers the primary form of leverage in their own salvation? Or, as we've taken to in the US for the last 20 years, are they 1/12 of the picture? This is a very common training diagram that you'll find in the US. And it says parents and, there's the employer in the middle, the boss. And we're studying the parents, subsidiaries, and siblings, the middle management, financial institutions, government regulations, politicians, suppliers and vendors, other employers, customer service, executive and shareholders, a lot about shareholders, like US pension capital is going to save us from capitalism anyway. Shareholders, public and civil society, media, and then there's this box, this equal box, one of them out of 12, called the workers. And I argue that that's part of what's gone wrong in the US. We now have really well-trained staff in communications, media, lawyers, pollsters, communicators, lawyers, researchers, who sort of run the fight in this sort of Alinsky-like jiu-jitsu model. And the workers are hardly ever involved anymore in union struggle in America. It's a workerless worker model, as I like to call it. And it's not working. So I went through that one. So what do organizers do? I think I just talked about this. I'm going to go more quickly. What we do is basically identify the organic leaders by having conversations with tens of thousands of workers. And once we've correctly identified them, we have to do something else, which is test them, which I'll talk about in a minute, to make sure we have the actual organic leader. But the third part of the model, the third critical factor, is this issue of governance. Is the union run with a low participation or a high participation model? Fundamental. Now we're into governance. How does the union run? And essentially, again, I'm putting the central question of the role of workers and the role of organizers at the middle. And there's a longer discussion about what's the purpose of the union. I touched on that, class struggle or winning a short deal for some people on their behalf. What's our analysis of the power going into the fight? What's the unionization model? Is it a corporate campaign with a bunch of really well-educated people sort of doing clever tricks to get a card check and neutrality deal and then signing up workers who don't know how they got the union? Is the collective bargaining model open, transparent, democratic? Are people involved in it? Do they struggle? And is the representation model in the union one that puts workers in control of struggling day to day between the life of the contract with their managers? Or is it a model where stewards and some staff are trained to service and represent people and do the work for workers that they are very capable of doing themselves? So the structure that I just mentioned about do we have the right organic leaders? Have we identified the majority of people who are capable of actually liberating themselves, not having staff do it for them, which isn't working? And there's lots of structure tests. By the way, the ultimate structure test is a strike. That's why I'm studying who's winning strikes today in America right now. Because you might have heard we don't really do them anymore. The truth is some people do, and we're still winning them. So if you can go on strike in America in very hard times and win, it means you've done everything else right. You've built a fighting organization, you've identified the organic worker leaders, and if you can pull a majority worker strike in the conditions we're in the US, you've built a worksite organization that's strong. And you've done it because you've identified organic worker leaders and you've trained them and skilled them up. And they are acting on their own behalf, not us on their behalf. This is what a structure test looks like. It's got 438 photos of workers. They took the photos themselves, they sent it to the boss, they marched it on to him, and then they sent it to every politician in town. There was a possible universe of 480 workers who could have had their photo taken. A majority structure test is something we do constantly to make sure we've got the real organic worker leaders. A strike, again, would be the ultimate test of have we actually identified organic worker leaders. Because if 90% of people will walk off their job and risk a lot in the US right now, they have built a fighting organization. This is from a strike vote that I took with thousands of workers in Nevada. Of course, they won 99.4% to win, along with some other strikes that we ran, picket signs, strikes. It's not that strikes are important. I've read several books saying that. It's how can we run a strike and win it today. That's what I'm talking about today. How we do it, not why it's important. Yes, happy, whatever. We all know it's important to strike, but there's only a few people still doing it. So the how we're doing it is everything I just described to you. And strikes matter a great deal. And constantly, we have to constantly, whether it's an environmental organization functioning at the community level or a community-based organization or a union. We have to constantly identify organic leaders, train them, and test whether or not we've got the right people. This has 3,800 and something signatures on it. We got it over several days because we said to the worker leaders, we're testing whether or not your structure is strong enough to stand up to management. Can you turn around a majority of signatures in a unit with 4,500 people in it in 3 days? Because if you can, then you're probably ready to have a really serious fight, the kind of fight that's going to win really profound changes in the lives of those workers. Strong worksite is key. This is a picture, on the bottom at least. I talk a lot about this in the book, Raising Expectations. This is what negotiations, when I led them, looked like. We had an open negotiations policy. Any and every worker was invited in. All workers were invited in. I would routinely walk into negotiations with hundreds of workers at a time. I will tell you it was a war to get management to even walk in the room. Our basic argument was if you can't get management to walk in the room, to even sit down and talk to you about the contract the way you want to talk about it in an open democratic trade union where everyone's welcome, you probably can't win that pension that you want. The two are related. So 1199, one of the unions I'm looking at who trained me, and I'll wrap up here in about 2 minutes. Just since the year 2000, the union has run over 100 strikes in America and won them. They are routinely able to create a crisis for the employer and the power elite. They have the highest contract standards in private sector nursing homes in America, and I think these are all related. They're real, they pulled people into middle-class jobs out of poverty and precarious work. And they have a political program that's sort of second to none that the workers own and run. And they were one of the only states in the entire disaster called the recent US election. We're in a hard-fought fight where the Koch brothers and all those guys came in to kill and take out the Democratic governor. One of the only victories in the whole country happened where this local is considered the strongest political player in the state because their members own their union and the members are battle-tested organic leaders and won a hard-fought fight to keep a governor who was actually good to workers, not bad to workers. And my argument is that basically once we surrendered strikes, we gave up needing to know how to build majorities, we gave up developing organic leaders, we stopped expanding our base, and the precariat is reemerging because of that in the relationship of class politics. Last comment for me is that we essentially took this model and extended it into the community. That's the workplace, non-workplace idea. And this is a picture in an early campaign I was leading about how we extended the union as a powerful organization into non-workplace fights. This, as you can see, a smattering, 2 little T-shirts on some organizers in there, teaching and training a bunch of people who lived in a public housing complex where our rank-and-file members lived. We did not represent the workers in the housing complex. We had members living in it. They got a notice the housing was going to get torn down. We were like, what the heck? And we created an enormous fight. And those workers had just come through some brutal private sector fights. They were smart. They were tenacious. They had become organizers themselves. They began to organize inside of the housing complexes, and they made history in America by being the only place in the US where something called a Hope 6, lovely Clinton-era neoliberal crap that came into our housing sector, where something called a Hope 6 privatization movement was defeated. So we had workers winning at work and winning at home. And they were doing it, not us, because they were skilled and battle-ready and tested and fighting for a class broadly. This is them taking over a housing authority meeting, which was the beginning of many rounds of fights where they stopped the destruction and demolition of 6 public housing complexes and won $30 million to expand public housing at a time when no one was winning money to expand public housing in the US. And so I call that whole worker organizing, which suggests that we should not attempt to divide human beings between work and non-work. We should build powerful organizations, put people into class struggle, break down the barriers between the workplace and non-workplace, and start fighting and winning again, because when we do it this way, we can. So that's it.
Thank you, Jane. You on here? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Jane. I love the contrast between this notion of mobilizing, aligning with this self-selecting group, the echo chambers, de-skilling, moving people away from, this notion of organizing, which is tapping into the base, creating the battle-tested organic leaders. we have about 20 minutes for a conversation, but just to kick it off, I have a question for you in terms of some of my experience in travels, both in the US and internationally as well. How does culture factor into some of this challenge between organizing and mobilizing? And specifically, when I go to the US, there's a very polarized space, right? There's a lot of dichotomy, us and them. But in Canada, my experience across the country working with many unions, whether it's Eastern or Western Canada or professional organizations, Canada has a culture of, I don't know if you've heard this, but how does a Canadian cross the road? Or why does a Canadian cross the road? To get to the middle, right? It's the idea that we're kind of centrist. We're not really polarized. We're not in this space of conflict and, war or militarization. That's kind of a cultural space. So my question to you first, and then we'll open it up to the floor for conversation, is how does mobilizing versus organizing in Canada factor in, given our culture is really not one of this polarizing space, but trying to find the middle?
I mean, I don't know, and I feel like you would have to answer that question. But I can tell you two things, at least my little impressions, having been spending more time here. One is I don't view Harper as walking to the middle.
Yeah, very true.
I think you have a sort of SOB in that position right now, and he is walking across the road, he's running as fast as he can, and he's going to drag everyone down if he can do it. And in Ontario, I was up there last spring, there was this guy Hudak running for office, who people defeated, and he was campaigning, however, on bringing right to work to Canada. There's now this woman, Lisa McLeod, who's sort of like hanging out with someone named Michelle Rhee, who's the key union buster in the US of teachers unions, and I'm seeing increasing collaboration, and so it's sort of why I'm giving a cautionary tale. I think Canadians are nice people, generally, which is why it's so nice to be here. But the truth is, you've got some ferocious right-wing leaders, and they're winning, and they're not nice. And if you don't think carefully about what it's going to take to build the kind of structures that can both defeat them, because he's rolling, and he's rolled back a lot of stuff. And if you can't stop them in the onslaught of dragging you into car crashes, they're going to roll.
That's what I love. The book, Raising Expectations, Raising Hell, right? She's a hellraiser. So this is good messages for us. So questions, conversation, things that you might want to ask, and I'll bring the mic up. Maybe what we'll do, if you can just put your hands up, I'm going to take, we take 3 questions? We'll take 3 questions, and then we'll let you answer kind of 3 as we go. So here's the first one. And actually, can we have both? Sure. Do you want to? So this is our first question right here.
I thank you very much for your talk. You touched on it in your talk about the way legislation such as the right to work legislation, puts barriers in the way our unions operate. And so we can only operate kind of within the generosity of the legislators who create the laws that allow the unions to exist in the first place. And we see examples like the Canadian federal government at the forefront of regressive labor legislation with bills like 377 and C525, where they're fundamentally trying to change the requirements for certification and decertification of unions. So I wonder if you can kind of help us learn how to kind of break free from those legislative shackles that bind us and how we can overcome that.
Okay, so the first question around legislative shackles. The second question over here, please, just right there.
I just had a question. I was wondering about what your general impressions are of the Organizing for Action, the successor organization for Obama's campaign. Not knowing a huge amount, but I see some similarities in methodology, perhaps. But the problem with Organizing for Action maybe is its goals, which are a little unclear. So but anyways, I don't want to preclude what you're going to say. I want to get your opinion of that whole organization.
Hi, I'm a public service worker, and
Thank you.
we are being torn to shreds by the current government, and the media message is that to balance the budget, they need to cut these positions. What's happening is the services that we provide are being taken away from the Canadian public. And it is getting worse and worse and worse. 36,000 jobs have been cut since this deficit reduction began, and the public really doesn't have any idea of how much has been cut for them. They talk about cutting taxes. The reality is we need to pay taxes to have services. We don't need to pay taxes to cut corporations' taxes. I want to know, what can we do to get that message out to the public? And I'm telling you, I talk to everybody that I can talk to, and I put my job on the line all the time because I have been told I cannot talk out against the government. But this government is destroying our Canadian services.
And Jane, just, in Alberta, you talked about not being infected by the United States or bad ideas, right, that can happen. But Alberta particularly gets this influence coming from the United States. So this issue of taxation is one of the big issues in Alberta that's constantly put up politically as, do everything but, no taxation. And what it creates is this constant boom-bust cycle, cutting of public service, undermining of what we have. So it's in Alberta compared to other provinces, there's an ongoing kind of an Americanization of attitude that happens in our politics and public as well. So there's 3 questions.
Yep. So sorry about that. We did pioneer this stuff. Just letting you know, we're number 1 in how to screw people and make them think that when you give them a tax decrease, you're giving them a raise. That's where it's going. That's what the neoliberalism logic is doing. In America, for many years, the right wing is perfecting a message that now has workers believing that they should vote to take their taxes down because that's going to equate to a raise. That's literally what people say. There'll be more money in my pocket if we cut the school education tax through property taxes. There'll be more money in my pocket if, right? So it could get a lot worse. I think you're on the front end of it. I'm going to sort of go backwards on the questions. I think, 1, good for you for fighting back and educating everyone you can. But 2 things about the public sector. And I've written a few articles in The Nation magazine about this. I mean, essentially, the attack on public sector unions is the way that they're going after the public sector. They understand that for all the faults that unions have, but I'll speak to my own country because, in the book I talk a lot about the problems. For all the faults we have, they do understand the power elite because they do their power analysis better than we do, or better than most of us do. They understand that to gut public services and to privatize public services, these guys are smart, these corporations. All the money from the public goes in. We build up these great systems like health systems, healthcare, schools. And in the US, we're way ahead of you in privatizing them, right? We have charter schools, privatization. They literally just take whole buildings that we paid for and take them, and now they run them for profit. So I think that it's going to take 2 things. One is they're coming after public sector unions, and it's going to get more intense here than it is right now, because that's the key thing they have to do to privatize massive amounts of services. And that is their number 1 goal. That's part of the neoliberal logic. So I think that you're not nearly as bad as us yet, even though I'm sure it feels brutal to you. And Harper, I know, feels brutal to people. When I came through customs the other day, I got into a conversation with the lovely worker who was checking out my passport. He's like, what are you going to do here? I'm like, oh, work with some unions. He's like, great, because Harper's killing us. I'm like, okay, well, he knows it too. So, and he was like, stamp that passport. And then I was talking to him for 10 minutes, and the line was there because he wanted to know what we could do. I'm like, that's a Canadian worker, you know what I mean? Let's get right into it when he's stamping the passport. I loved him. So I would say, I think that your union, first of all, everyone has to get into this fight. You know, hold your nose. You're pissed off at a union? Yeah, they annoy me too. But guess what? They are the only thing standing between destitution and total poverty and sanity right now in this country. The only thing. I get so annoyed with what our trade unions do so many days of the week, and at the end of the day, I'm out there slogging away and fighting to defend them. Because we have to fight from the inside to change our union's bad behavior, not from the outside, and everyone. I mean, I wrote a huge article about the Keystone XL fight, you know, a cover story for The Nation a couple of years ago, where I just attacked the head of the laborers union in the US, and he should be attacked for his position on this issue. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that we should throw out unions, because if we do, they are the best organization we've ever had at experiments in deliberative democracy and in winning fundamental change for people. And just like the examples I gave, I kid you not, if you read the book, or even if you don't, in very tough turf, we won contracts that changed people's lives. They literally changed their lives in the 2000s in America. So it is totally still possible. Perfect? Heck no. Better than nothing? Definitely. So everyone has to rally around the defense of unions and the defense of the public sector. And our public sector unions have to do much better than they're doing here and in the US. And for me, it's the whole worker thing I talked about last. You have broad connections. Every public sector worker has friends, neighbors, people who play hockey, hockey clubs, little leagues, soccer clubs. Maybe you go to church. We do that more in the US, I think, than here, but a lot of people do. You have all these different ways that you connect organically as workers to your community. We have to start systematically mapping them. We have to start engaging people in what this really means. And it's not enough for just you to do that. It's got to be a serious union-wide program and a serious movement-wide program to connect up with all the pre-existing social relationships we have in our communities, because we have more than them. But we can't just think we can just go talk. It's got to be systematic. Everything I laid out here was systematic. It's a program. It's deliberate. It takes discipline. It takes work to do it. So that's the level of the public education we have to get to, and that's going to lead me right into organizing for action, which I'm just done with, personally. Saying it out loud. So first of all, it's a mobilizing model. You know, it's not an organizing model. That's the hurting people mobilizing. I get my urgent email every day telling me what's going to happen, and I'm sick of them. And the guys, the things they're asking me to do are like vote for a bunch of losers who haven't done a thing for us in, I don't know, a bunch of years. So I think it's a mobilizing model that's failing. I know everyone I know just forgets the emails they get from them every day at this point. So our expectations have to be raised by real work and real victories and real struggle in order for us not to sit home on election day. So I just think it was a huge, colossal failure. I actually wrote a proposal to the Obama team, by the way, about what we could do with that list in the fall of 2000. Just after the election, I was actually asked, when I was National Deputy Director, to write a think piece for what we could do with the Obama list. And boy, that was laughed out of the room, because it was going to organize every community in America off that list. So there are choices. That's what I mean about bad strategy. We are making bad decisions. It's not that Americans don't want to fight, and it's not that Canadians don't want to fight. It takes strategy. It takes power analysis. It takes some skill to build an army. I kid you not. So, and the legislation, sort of same. I mean, we're not going to defeat the legislation until we get our movement muscle back. And our movement muscle comes from putting people into struggle, which is why I'm looking at strikes, because having a movement muscle matters. In the US, it's largely atrophied. If you can win a strike, you can build a powerful army. In Connecticut, we've defeated bad legislation, and we saved a good governor. So it's all related. It's, do we have powerful worksite organizations in the union sector? Have we built powerful community-based organizations if they're struggling just out in the community? Have we developed organic leaders, et cetera? There's a whole parallel discussion about in the US, what did the Alinsky-based sector do? What did ACORN do? What did the Industrial Areas Foundation do? What did they all do? We fell into this sort of mobilizing model, and it's deficient. But I'm also a fan of breaking rules, you might imagine. I think it's perfectly fine for us to break rules, and we're going to have to do it. We do it in the US, and we're going to have to do it in Canada, and I know some people here do it. I'm very proud of reading about a bunch of not legal strikes that people have been winning. So sometimes we have to break the law and take really big risk, which is hard to do for anyone, but we also have to defeat those laws. But it's a catch-22. We're not going to defeat the legislation until we rebuild a powerful fighting base. So I'm obsessed with how do we rebuild that powerful fighting base. And going back to sort of the truisms of being patient, front-end work, identifying organic worker leaders, training them, skilling them up, I think is the only way to save ourselves from near doom that's coming as neoliberalism spreads.
Thank you. If we can just get another mic right to the top. What we're going to do is we're going to take two more. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Two more, and then we're going to go into our break. So we have one up here, and I think this lady had her hand up. So we'll take those last two questions, and then after, Jane, you're going to be here for some more conversations.
All day, listening to
I
all of you.
want to be on the picket line with you, just saying.
They're fun.
My question is, you talk about breaking laws and changing laws. What about taking our government to court when they break our laws? The example that I can give you personally is my brother is one of the 4 litigants on the Canadian Wheat Board case against the Canadian government for taking the assets of farmers, and when they illegally shut down the Canadian Wheat Board, which was a farmer organization, and taking those assets from farmers rather than distributing them amongst the permit holders, and then just taking those away and not recognizing, not following the laws of the land, doing things the way they want to.
Thank you. And actually, I don't know if you're aware of British Columbia, but the British Columbia Teachers Federation took the government to court, actually won in the Supreme Court. Government then put resources back into fighting. This is a common theme, right? About how do we hold our governments accountable through the court system, but at the same time, what happens even when the Supreme Courts put down rulings and then governments reject those very rulings?
Okay, specifically, how can we here in Canada, in 1 year or less, build the powerful army to defeat the current
Yeah, not trying to get to the middle, but moving to the right.
I'm sure I'd be very proud to know your brother. That sounds really great. So I think that legal fights matter. I think they all matter. We have to do them. So British Columbia, we've done them. I would say this: the role of legal strategy is a tactic in our bigger fight, and it's a very important one sometimes. The sort of downsides to legal stuff is, 1, it costs a lot of money, generally. 2, it's slow. It's long. Because the right wing has the power to appeal, and then they appeal, and then even though they lose in one court, they appeal again because they're bleeding us dry because their goal is actually to defund us. So in the US, they take advantage of legal strategies by bleeding us dry, and maybe 10 years later we get to the appellate court level, and they've whacked a whole bunch of more people in that 10 years. But do I think we need to do it still? Absolutely. It's just that it's not the only thing that we should do, and it should be part of a repertoire and a comprehensive strategy that's about building power. So I think legal stuff matters. In Connecticut, the first time I was ever involved in a very large mass-scale strike was the largest nursing home strike in America that we did in 2001. The sitting governor at the time broke every law there was. He rolled out tanks to bring scabs into private sector nursing homes, like where old people were. It's like crazy. He actually rolled out tanks and called out the National Guard against us. And more importantly, the real law violation was that he announced on day 1 of the strike that he would reimburse all the 78 nursing home operators for the cost of the scabs for the entire life of the strike, which pretty much meant the state was no longer neutral under labor law and undermined us in incredibly powerful ways in that strike. So we sued him. And guess what? We won. And we won 6 years later. He was already in jail because he was a corrupt pig anyway, and he was already in jail for other corruption reasons. But we won 6 years later. It didn't help us in the strike, right? In the strike, we had to fight it out on the streets against him. So I think legal stuff matters. We should do it. In the US, and the Supreme Court's so conservative, we got to stop doing legal strategy because we had a court that's going to give us every bad ruling possible. So you just got to take this all into account, right? It's sort of contextual. And then how do you do it in 2 years or less? Well, 1 year or less. I don't know about 1. I think 1's rough. Although I think you should pick some places and dig in. I seriously mean that. I think we have to make priorities. You have to have a strategy. You should be looking for places in Canada, like we did at sometimes in the US, to where is it most important and most possible to dig in for a fight? Pick some targeted geographies, ideally get the unions to do things that we forgot how to do, which is actually collaborate and build solidarity, not kill each other. That would go a long way, and rank and file members should start demanding that unions cooperate in ways that they seem to have forgotten how to. And we can do a lot when we do that. And then partner with the environmental groups, the women's groups, civil rights groups, queer, lesbian, gay, everyone in one big fight. And in Connecticut, what I'll tell you about the Vegas stories that I talk about in the book, we had 2 years. So, that's not a lot more than 1 year, by the way. It's not impossible. Like in 2 years, we built a fighting army. So I believe that when we stick to the discipline of the work, we can actually do it much more quickly than we think we can. Because we're used to losing right now, which is a terrible thing. Our muscle for fighting has kind of atrophied. But my experience is that all over the United States, everywhere I ever went and had the pleasure of leading campaigns, American workers and poor people and their allies were actually ready to fight. So when we don't demobilize them and diskill them, and when we actually enable them and empower them into the fight, they will fight, and they will fight hard, because they're pissed off and tired of the kind of brutal assault that we've been under in the US. So I think it's not unreasonable to say that you can do this quickly, because we did it quickly. And the whole reason I wrote that book was to say, not only can we do it, we can do it quickly when we're disciplined. So with that, I thank you very much for all of your time this morning. I look forward to hearing all the discussion all day.
So, just before everybody gets up and moves, on behalf of the Parkland Institute, the organizers, all of us in this room, we want to thank you for coming here. We hope this is one of many return visits to Alberta. And I also have an announcement. The Seniors Action and Liaison team is having a public meeting on November 25th from 1:30 to 3:30 in Sir Winston Churchill Square. It's November 25th, 1:30 to 3:30 in Sir Winston Churchill Square, to discuss the findings and draft recommendations related to the Seniors Action and related to the Continuing Care Resolution team. So that's November 25th, if you're interested. And again, please join me in thanking Jane for her morning.
Thank you.
That was really good.
Oh, what's
Really
that?
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.